Welcome to episode 16 of the Argue With Me podcast. My apologies, I haven't uploaded in a little while, so I'll try to make up for that this weekend by uploading a couple of episodes. Just been busy at work and with other things, and haven't been able to do this project, which ultimately is really more for fun than anything else. And I hope it's fun for everyone that listens too. In this episode, I'm talking to Chris Freiman, a philosopher who you might remember from a previous episode where we discussed his utilitarianism. That comes up again in this episode. But the episode is actually about universal basic income, UBI. This episode came off the heels of a recent debate between Chris Freiman and Bryan Caplan, who I also hope to get onto this podcast pretty soon. And Bryan Caplan, of course, was taking the side that the UBI is not a good idea, and Chris Freiman, and I'm simplifying this drastically, was on the side of the UBI basically being a better idea than what we have now. And the two of them had much disagreement over that. I think Bryan would prefer things the way they are now over a UBI, and that's for various reasons that we get into actually in this discussion. I'm not sure how much I disagree with Chris really in general, but we often have different ways of looking at things even when we do converge. So I think the conversation was interesting, and ultimately I pressed him quite a bit on, as a utilitarian, if he thinks the UBI might come in on top of all of the social programs that exist right now, whether it makes sense for him to be promoting the UBI at all, given that his belief is that the UBI is simply better than the present situation. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, welcome to the Argue With Me podcast. I'm excited to have back Chris Freiman, a philosopher and libertarian, and as we discussed last time, a utilitarian libertarian, which I got accused of being the other day, which I thought was kind of neat.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah. I had said something like the reason I like libertarianism is really it's just instrumental reasons. Like it does a lot of things people say they want, and I said that's the primary reason I like it, and so that makes me a utilitarian apparently. So
Might be the first step. Might be the first step.
yeah. I don't think that brings me all the way to utilitarianism, but anyway, but that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking today about UBI, the Universal Basic Income. And you recently had a debate with something of a debate anyway, with Bryan Caplan about this. That was the Institute for Liberal Studies, I think it is.
Yes.
Yeah, and I should I always it's liberal or humane. I'm like, which one do I say? Because anyway, so that's Matt Buffton's thing anyway, and he's great and he's good at putting that stuff together. And so I'm not sure that this is really a follow-up on that debate, but people can go check that out if they're interested in it. I think they should go check it out because it was fun. Um, but mostly I wanted to talk to you about, first of all, what you think the case for UBI is. And then I wanted to sort of present to you some challenges I think UBI has that I didn't really hear come up too precisely in your conversation with Bryan. So maybe I kick it over to you first, if you want to just lay out the general case for UBI and what kind of UBI and that sort of thing.
Sure. So the position that I took in my debate or discussion with Bryan was that it would be preferable if we could replace the status quo with a UBI. So whether or not in an ideal world, in a perfect libertarian world, we would have a UBI, that's a separate question. I think that's an interesting question, and it's one that I'm happy to talk about. But I think the more modest position is if we could replace the current system of entitlements with something like a UBI, would that be an improvement? And I think the answer is yes. And I think there are several reasons to think this. So one is just it's better for recipients to get cash than to get resources in kind. So things like medical care in kind. And I give this little thought experiment to motivate the idea. So imagine you're at work and your boss comes in and says, "Oh, we've had this great year. I'll give you an option as to how you want to be rewarded. I can either cut you a check for few $1,000s, or for the rest of the year, I can buy you $3,000 or whatever worth of like lunches and office snacks. And it seems as though everybody would rather have the cash. Why? Well, if you want the lunches and the snacks that money could have purchased, you can just buy them with the cash. Or if you want something else, you can use the cash to buy that something else. And so cash gives people the freedom to sort of purchase those things that they consider in their best interest, so that they're not relying on somebody else's judgment as to what they really need. And so I think that's one of the major advantages of a UBI. So if you like the sort of stuff that the state is providing you with now, you'll have the cash to purchase those sorts of things. But if you would rather do something else, you could do something else with that money. And I think this is a point that libertarians should generally be pretty friendly to, which is, look, so this goes back to at least John Stuart Mill, but he makes a sort of anti-paternalist argument. He makes a number of anti-paternalist arguments, but one is just, look, you know more about your good than I do, and you're more motivated to pursue your good than I am. And so when I give you cash, or when you get cash through a UBI, you have more knowledge of how to use those resources to your advantage than I do. And you have a stronger incentive to use them wisely. And so I think that's a very powerful argument in favor of replacing the status quo with the UBI. Another issue with the status quo is that in many cases, it creates what are known as benefit cliffs. So the idea here is that in certain cases, by, for example, finding work, you might actually have a net reduction in income because you end up losing some of the transfer as a result of increasing your income. And so this creates perverse incentives that the UBI would not have, because the UBI, it just cuts checks to everybody, regardless of their work status. And so it wouldn't have these benefit cliffs. And I think that's another advantage of the UBI. Then lastly, there's sometimes a misconception surrounding the idea of the UBI where they say, look, there's something deeply unfair or regressive about sending everybody checks, because this means Bill Gates is getting checks in the mail. And, why are we sending a check to Bill Gates? That's, he doesn't need it. Why would we do this? And it's true that Bill Gates is getting checks in the mail. I guess maybe not in the mail. I'm sure we could do this electronically these days.
I don't know. It's the government we're talking about. Probably be
yeah. Maybe they'll send it by telegraph.
Yeah.
Can you send? I don't know if you can transfer money. You can wire transfer. I don't know if you can transfer money via telegraph. That's
I'll have a horse, a guy with a horse in a saddle.
A horse, yes,
yeah.
That's right. Drop it off at your door.
Yeah.
But so it is true that Bill Gates is getting some money as a result of the UBI, but he's paying far more in taxes than he's getting back. So he is not a net consumer, so to speak, under that system. So it would be progressive. So as you make, if you keep the current tax structure in place, which is not ideal, but again, if we're just saying hold everything else fixed and just replace the status quo with a UBI, you say, look, Bill Gates is still paying a lot more in taxes than he's consuming. Yes, it's true, he's getting that check in the mail, still a net tax payer. And so it would be progressive. And so I think you take these three considerations together, that it's better for recipients to have cash to spend as they see fit on their own needs. It eliminates some of these perverse incentives created by benefit cliffs. And it would be progressive. I think those are very good reasons to support a UBI. Again, not perfect. What we would have in a perfect world, who's to say? But I think it's better than what we've got.
Right. So and that's something I want to stress is, and we were just talking about that. You're not like an undying defender of UBI. This is going to be I'm going to the grave on this one. This is it, right? This is something you're saying, and you've said it over and over again. So I just want to make sure this is clear to everybody. This is just a logically preferable system in your view to what is happening right now. It's not necessarily the morally right system or the perfect system or the system you would want to design, but it is nonetheless better than what's happening now. That's accurate.
That's right. And the thing is too, sort of along those lines, is I think it is a mistake to think of something like the UBI as this is the key ingredient to alleviating poverty. I think it could help. I think it's again an improvement over what we have. But like really, what are the most powerful mechanisms we have for alleviating poverty? And they really are things like deregulating markets, let capitalism do its thing, let it make us rich. And so I don't know. Here's the other point. A UBI is like an icing on is icing on the cake, but the cake is capitalism. And so I think it's a mistake to think, no, like what we really need to focus our attention on is the UBI. Again, worth doing, but doing things like, deregulating housing markets, getting rid of occupational licensing, free trade, just, the whole laundry list of
It's, you
stuff
know
that I'm
what?
sure your listeners are familiar with.
It's not like the icing on the cake. It's like the peanut butter that makes you swallow the pill. That's what it's more like. Like the
So in
pill,
this,
what's good for
so
you is
this
the
is what,
deregulation. The
so I'm,
peanut,
yeah, so I'm a dog in this analogy then, because I think this is how we get like dogs to take pills. Like I can take a pill without the peanut butter. So I mean, but that is an interesting way of so you might, I mean, so one argument would be it's almost sort of a strategic concession where you say, look, if you'll give me unregulated capitalism, I'll give you. I think that's interesting. So I do think that there will plausibly be cases, even in a sort of a free market libertarian type economy, where there are people in need who will not be able to get what they need simply through private charity. So I would say so I would go with the icing, the icing image, where it's not just a strategic, like this makes the bitter medicine go down kind of thing. It's like I think it could be genuinely helpful in some cases. Now, rebuttal to that, which I think is sort of interesting, is you could say, well, look, actually, if so, this is a perennial topic for libertarians where they say, would charity be enough to take care of poverty? I think that there's an interesting follow-up question, which is, well, in what sort of world are we talking about? The current world, or are we talking about the libertarian world? And I would say if you have libertarian background assumptions, where you say, look, if we had a world with free trade, deregulated labor markets, deregulated housing markets, we would just have considerably less poverty. And I'm not arguing for that right now. I believe that it's true, but I'm not arguing for it. But if you have these same sorts of libertarian background assumptions, you would say, in that world, there probably will be far fewer people in need. And so in that case, it's not completely unrealistic to think that private charity could do the job. I don't want to take a stand on that. I mean, that's going to be conjecture. But I would say if it does turn out that private charity is not enough, even in that society, I'm pro UBI in that case. But again, that's the
all right.
icing on the cake. That's not the cake.
So yeah, okay. So let me, this actually segues nicely into I think it was the first argument you made for UBI, which is it allows people to, chase after what they prefer rather than what you give them. Um, but I think that actually is kind of a flaw with UBI in some ways too, um, because like, and this comes from some real life experience, but also from my psychology background, and that is that if the reason you're giving out money is because this person can't take care of themselves, then handing them money is going to make it potentially worse. They won't be able to take care of themselves. Like they'll make bad choices with the money. Um, and I don't say this with judgment, and I have a whole other thing about my theory of morals in a separate recording um, that I'm going to be releasing, which would make it clear why I couldn't be saying this with judgment. It's just like I'm looking at this from like it's just a factual point of view. Some people have psychological conditions where they can't take care of themselves, and then in that case, I think the UBI might not do as good a job as the present system. Um, and I don't think the present system does a very good job either. And I think the answer might be that it is impossible to help these people, regardless of what you do, at least for now, until we have better, medical ways of intervening. So what do you think about that criticism of the UBI that like a lot of the money that you're going to be handing to people, they're literally incapable of making the choices you would hope they would make, which is after all, like as you just articulated, the purpose of the handout, right?
Well, so let me ask a follow-up question. So you said
Sure.
literally incapable.
Yeah.
So I think there's a big difference between somebody who would get the cash and they would spend it all, betting on college football. And you're like, I have nothing against betting on college football, but that's probably not a wise use of that. So that's one sort of case.
Yeah.
Another sort of case is, I don't know, they have some sort of medical or like cognitive condition where they like literally are not capable of using that cash in a way that helps them live a decent life. So are you thinking more of that second sort of case or more of the first
I
case?
actually don't distinguish between the two. So the first sort of case where somebody can't stop gambling is to me just as biologically determined as somebody who's schizophrenic and just doesn't even have the wherewithal to, know like that they're even receiving a check in the mail or by horse and satchel. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
right. So in the case of somebody who like is not, let's say not even capable of getting the check and buying things with it. So I think that is a distinct issue. So like we could leave aside these sort of deeper questions about moral responsibility, but it seems like in that case the issue is not so much is the status quo welfare state better or worse than a UBI? Then it's just sort of like do other people have obligations to take care of that person because they're incapable of taking care of themselves? And so you might say, if they have a guardian or something like that, then you could trust the guardian, I presume, with cash, for example. But so let me bracket that sort of case for the moment and go to the person who spends money on gambling. I mean, I think that's definitely a possibility. We can't rule it out. There will be people who spend a UBI on gambling. But here's a case where there are costs and there are benefits. So there are people who are going to use cash in ways that are worse for them than what they would get under the status quo. But there are also people who would spend the cash doing things that are better for them than what they get under the status quo. And so, like, what percentage of the? I'm not really sure. But let me give you a thought experiment. So in essence, I think what you're arguing for, maybe you don't like this term, maybe you'll reject this term, is that there's almost a paternalistic justification for the status quo, where we're not just giving people cash to spend as they see fit. We're actually giving them stuff. And this kind of came up in the discussion with Bryan, where it's like, if you're giving people stuff in kind, like education, healthcare, food stamps, etc., that's stuff that's like it's hard to use in a way that's detrimental to them. And so there's this paternalistic justification for the status quo. So if that's the view, I mean, I would say, so
well,
would
can
you want
I?
to make the status?
I
Yeah,
would just
yeah.
I would just back up and say there's a paternalistic reason to do either UBI or have the status quo. I find them both paternalistic. They're both saying like you can't take care of yourself, so I have to send you some money, and it's going to either come in one form or the other. And the other one form might be slightly more paternalistic than the other. And I don't like either of them, right? So I'm completely, if I had to choose, I would choose a completely non-paternalistic viewpoint. But yes, Bryan did make that argument.
Okay. So let me ask you a follow up, if I
Sure.
may. So
Yeah.
so we could make the status quo even more paternalistic,
Yeah.
but I don't think people would like that. So this is not a particularly well thought out proposal that I'm about to float here. But take Social Security for example. Um, that's sending people money. So it's like, yeah, I don't trust people. Like, I don't know. People might use their Social Security check to gamble on college football. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to get rid of Social Security and we're going to spend that money that would otherwise go to Social Security for like, I don't know, free assisted living or something like that. So, and like there we can make sure like people are well fed, et cetera, et cetera. But they would have very little choice. Like if they want that benefit, they got to go into assisted living where people take care of them. I think we'd say, no, that's like, I mean, that seems to me too paternalistic.
Yeah, it's
Or,
bad. I don't
you could
like it.
imagine a
Yeah.
case.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Or you could say like, SNAP benefits, for example. It's like that's in some sense more paternalistic than giving people cash, but you could imagine that being even more paternalistic, where you say, we're not even going to say, here's, you know, items that are eligible for you to buy with Snap. We're just going to send like I don't know, like the home meal delivery stuff. You know what I'm talking about? Where it's like they'll
Yep.
send you
Yeah, yeah.
like pre-made meals to your door. Suppose we say, oh, let's replace Snap benefits with that, and like that way, we are sending people like broccoli and you know, I don't know, salmon or something like that. So like we know they're not drinking too much Dr. Pepper.
I
It's
could use
like,
that help. Yeah.
well,
That's
well, no, like, but we're like, oh, like, but so like, this is like, we don't like people drinking. Like, I don't know whatever happened to the big gulp ban in New York,
oh
but that
yeah.
was like a thing for a while. It's like, we don't like people drinking too much soda, like too much Mountain Dew, not good. It's like, it's not good. But it's like, would we be comfortable saying, look, we will provide people in need with food, but we're not even going to give them the option to go to the grocery store. I mean, they can if they want, but they won't be able to use the benefit there. We're just going to send them broccoli, salmon, quinoa. Is that how you say it? I don't know if I'm
Yeah.
pronouncing it
I
right.
think you got
Quinoa
it
is like a
right.
healthy
Yeah.
something. Like so I don't think most libertarian minded people would be okay with that. And so my view is like, so like we're either going like, I don't think the status quo is like a principled stopping point for paternalism. I think if
No.
we're really worried about the paternalistic, or we're really worried that we have to be paternalistic, then we would go even further. But I don't think, I think we're like, look, you know, you give people the resources to make decisions about their own life. And sometimes that will not work out well, but other times it will. And again, generally speaking, we think that people are the sort of best judges of their
Well,
own
well,
self-interest.
let me, okay, so generally speaking, we do think that, and I think that it has to be true. Otherwise, I don't think we could have a society to begin with if generally people weren't somewhat rational, somewhat able to make their own decisions, that sort of thing. Um, but the people we're talking about, and again, I don't have any animus towards these people at all. Um, the people we're talking about that need these ostensibly need these payments are the ones that are proportionately most likely to not be able to defend themselves against the world, basically, and make these rational choices and do something valuable with the money. And I think that's just like I'm coming at this from basically an empirical point of view, right? It's just as you get to the more needy, there are going to be a higher percentage of them that fall into that category. There will also be plenty of people who don't fall into that category and are capable of getting out of that category or don't want to or whatever. So I think there's like a special consideration here, right? And I agree from the point of view that of paternalism that UBI is probably less paternalistic on average than the present system, but I still think it's quite paternalistic because it's basically saying to people, I don't trust you to make charitable donations enough to take care of people who really can't. And so I'm going to do this for you. Um, so
Yeah,
yeah,
well,
like, yeah,
I mean, I do think so on that last point. Yeah, I mean, I mean, again, this goes back to the question of do we want the UBI now versus would we want it in Libertopia? I don't know what
yeah,
the word is.
sure.
And so you say like, but now like I do think there's not enough charity to meet the need. I don't know if I don't know if that's paternalistic exactly because it's in that case you're not forcing people to do things or not do things for their own good. It's more like you don't trust them to do enough for the good of other people. I mean, that
Right.
maybe that's still objectionable for a different sort of reason. We could talk about that. But then also though on your previous point, I mean, so I think though in the status quo, there are lots and lots of cases of people in poverty because of institutional reasons. So like just to take like a very prominent example right now, like I mean, I think this is as much, if not more, of an issue in Canada than it is in the U.S. But like the housing crisis,
Oh,
like
it's
we're just
worse
not
here.
building enough. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's awful. And so you have people without housing, and it's not because they can't make competent decisions about their own lives. It's because the institutions are so completely dysfunctional. And here again, if you have sort of broadly libertarian background assumptions, you're going to say labor markets are screwed up in all sorts of ways. again, the housing market is screwed up in all sorts of ways. And if we made those better, there would probably be a lot of poverty. But I think it is hard to say right now, given that we have all of this institutional dysfunction in our economy, that we say, well, the fact that somebody would need assistance from a UBI is evidence that we can't trust them to make their own decisions. I think that's way too quick, because I think there are lots of institutional reasons why people might need a UBI under the status quo. Yeah, so I mean, we could talk a bit more too about this idea of, whether, I mean, I don't know, what do you think? In Libertopia, do we have
Oh,
a UBI?
okay.
I
Well,
think you
actually,
say no.
that's
That's
really
my
good.
my
Yeah,
sense.
I would say no to UBI and Libertopia. But the reason I would do it isn't for any of the reasons I've articulated, or I would say no, isn't for any of the reasons I've articulated so far. It's because, and this is going to sound utilitarian again. Um, and this is actually the main thing I wanted to ask you about. Okay, how best to articulate this? Each time the government takes money from someone, I don't care who, the popular example these days is Elon Musk, but it could be anybody who's doing something productive and gives it to somebody else, we lose some productivity, right? Like if we accept, like you said, those background presumptions that libertarian theory about how markets enrich people, and then each time we interfere, we might save an individual, we might make them better off, but it's at the cost of someone in the future. And then eventually what will happen is that you are mortgaging many people's futures for people right now, and you have a worse overall result despite having a good intention now. That undoubtedly has happened. And for example, the housing market is a great example of this. Um, the so from a utilitarian point of view, like you, Chris Freiman, could talk about anything you want. UBI, and I guess I'm guilty of this too by virtue of having this episode about UBI, but UBI is something that's really popular in Canada, and it keeps getting added to the status quo. There's no discussion about removing the status quo, right? And I know you're not for that. I'm not saddling you with that at all. Like that's not your point at all, as we've been clear several times. But my worry is that UBI is insufficiently utilitarian, actually. I think it will cause worse things to happen in the future than otherwise.
Yeah, so just on
Mm.
that point about it getting layered on top,
Yeah,
I've read that that's why Milton Friedman stopped advocating for a negative income tax. He's like, I like this idea, but I like it as a replacement for what we have, not in addition to what we have.
yeah,
And that's kind of my attitude about a UBI. So it could be the case that the only way we would actually get it in the real world is if we layer it on top of the status quo, which like I said, I'm not in favor of. But yeah, so to your point, I feel the force of that objection. So I do think people really underrate the significance of economic growth.
yeah,
So even really small changes in the growth rate can have really big consequences over a sufficiently long period of time. And so if a UBI does mean that we grow at a somewhat slower rate, I think that is a real problem. Like there are interesting philosophical questions too about, well, should we value future lives as much as we value present lives?
yeah.
I think the answer is yes. I think we should value future lives, although it's complicated. But so I think that to me is the strongest objection. Is that look, it might only have a small negative impact on economic growth, but even a small negative impact is big over time. One thought on that though is that seems to me, so in the case that you gave, you were presuming that it would be funded via something like income taxation. But my Libertopia is maybe not yours, because I might be okay with, I don't know, maybe I've just been brainwashed into liking a land value tax. But like in my Libertopia, like I'm okay, maybe I think if we have like a land value tax, maybe we add a carbon tax. And you say, oh, okay, like that's not going to generate tons of revenue. But like it's probably not going to have a negative impact on social welfare, those sorts of taxes. That way you're not worried about highly productive members of society losing resources that could go to economic growth.
Well, I think we probably do have slightly different libertopia ideas, right? But so like in mine, for example, if I was going to deal with carbon, I wouldn't want a tax. I would want a case, a court case. Like I like the idea of internalizing the costs to polluters and that sort of thing. I just think that a tax is not the best way to do it. I think damages are the best way to do it. Um, so yeah, I'm not really like if I had to categorize myself, it would be an anarcho-capitalist with some skepticism about whether it's theoretically viable. So I'm not fervently like, hey, this is the only possible answer. It might turn out that human psychology does not allow that to happen. But I find that, just based on data, the closer we get to it, the better it seems like society goes. So that's really the only direction I'm heading here.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of how to deal with pollute, so this is maybe the wishy-washy thing that utilitarians have to say is, I'm open to your solution. Whether or not it's more efficient than just having a tax, is going to be an empirical question. And at this point, so like what I always say is like, I don't know. So libertarians like to debate this. Do we want, anarcho-capitalism? Do we want a minimal state? Do we want like, so it's like, do you want, the anarcho-capitalist? Do you want like Robert Nozick, or do you want like Milton Friedman? It's like those are like the
Well,
three. So
I'll tell you right now, I think Friedman's the GOAT. I just think he's the
oh,
GOAT.
no, so many times people they think my last name is Friedman, and I take that as a giant compliment.
Right.
No, I think Friedman's great, and so maybe it's like I don't have like I lean towards Friedman if I'm picking between those three options, but I also say when those are like the three most viable presidential candidates, that's when I might really start to worry about which one to choose. But like in the
Yeah, yeah,
meantime,
yeah, yeah.
like we can get close enough. Like we're far off from Friedman. When we get to Friedman, then I'll talk to the Nozickians, and maybe they can tell me I like
That's
government too much.
Yeah, that's fine. But look, to bring us back to right now, we're talking about the UBI, and nothing good can come from this. I think that what will happen is that the UBI will happen, and it's going to get pasted on top of everything else. And I think that maybe libertarians, like we understand. I understand the logical argument you're making. It's not wrong in the sense that it might be and probably is better than the current system in most ways, if not all. But then I know that it's like, okay, now the libertarians are on board to a UBI. There's nobody who's not. This is going forward for sure, which it might anyway, whether the libertarians say anything or not. But it's good to have to set a record, as they say. We told you so. You know what So I don't know. What do you think?
Told you
Like,
told you so in the sense that I told you so that if we get it, it's going to be on top of what
yeah,
we have rather
exactly.
than, yeah,
Yeah.
no, I think so. Like, I think a perennial issue for libertarians is one of I think the most powerful motivations for being a libertarian is you're really worried about public choice problems. You say, oh, there's this policy that would be very good if we could get people to act in a certain way. But of course, we don't like political actors. They're largely motivated by self-interest. And so you can have this plan that looks really good on the chalkboard, but then when you actually attempt to institutionalize it in reality, it's like it ends up looking very different. And so like that, I think is true of like a lot of stuff. Or it's like, oh, this would be very good if we could get it. Like, well, like, how are we going to get it? I'm like, oh, I don't know. But so your point is well taken. So what I will concede is that at most, this is an argument for me to shut up about the UBI
Yes.
because well, no, hold on. Well, so here's so if I can digress for a second,
For
if I can
sure. Yeah.
digress for a second. So I joke. So in one of my books, I tell people like you shouldn't vote. You should do charitable activity instead. You're like, well, look, like I'm kind of with you, but here's the problem. Like if people listen to you, then millions of people will stop voting and this will be a disaster. And I say, look, I love this objection because it's so flattering to me.
Yeah.
Like people, like I have millions of people waiting to hear what I'm saying, and then they will follow my advice. And I'm thinking, like, there's the old joke, you can't even get your students to read the syllabus.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't think I have millions of people waiting for instructions for me on whether to vote or whether to fight for UBI. But so here's what I will say then. So if I am presented with compelling evidence that my UBI advocacy, my moderate UBI advocacy, will actually make a meaningful difference to the chances of a UBI getting institutionalized on top of the status quo, I will stop advocating for it. But I guess yeah, I'm not confident enough that people actually
Wait.
listen to what I'm saying.
Is
What I'm saying is true. What I'm saying is true, but it might be it might have negative consequences to tell people the truth because they'll run with it in a way that produces bad consequences.
yes. Yes. I think that's the primary objection I have about this topic with libertarianism in general, not so much like you in particular necessarily. I think is that look, the more we talk about it, and we say like, yeah, okay, then nobody listens to us anyway, and that's true. However, I mean, like someday someone might, and you know when they will listen to you, when they will listen to you is when it's convenient, right? So like nobody's going to listen to you and I talk about growth curves with the number E on a graph and like, hey, as soon as you take this percent away from Elon Musk, you're killing 7,000 people in the future. Nobody's going to listen to that. But if all of a sudden it's like, Professor, like, well, I'll just use Matt Smolinski because he's very well known for this. Like, Professor Smolinski is an advocate of UBI and he's a libertarian. It doesn't help. You know what I
Well,
mean?
let me ask you this.
Yeah,
So now you're faced with a moral dilemma. Are you
sure.
going to air this episode or not?
I said that
Because then you
earlier.
would be
Yeah,
complicit. Yeah,
I
like
know.
I don't know.
I said that earlier. Now, I think that it might still be good for me to air this just because it might get people to stop talking about the UBI so much. But I don't know. Maybe it would backfire.
Well, so I don't know if this will fully assuage your worry, but like I don't know. In terms of things that I talk about, I'd say a fairly small percentage
Yeah.
is UBI related. And this goes back to the earlier point about what's the cake and what's the icing on the cake. Like I
Mhm.
think really the things we should be talking about are again things like deregulating housing, deregulating labor markets, these sorts of things. Also, too, I mean, this is relevant to the UBI discussion too, and this came up in the discussion with Kaplan. I think even so, if we say some sort of redistribution is on the table, so again, maybe in your Libertopia we have zero, maybe in Nozick's Libertopia we have zero. But if redistribution is on the table, and I think as a matter of moral principle, it should be on the table. I'm not opposed to it in principle. It is far more urgent to fund programs that benefit the global poor rather than the domestic poor. So people who are sort of at the poverty line in the US are somewhere, they're like top 15, top 16% of incomes in the world. And so like the UBI is not addressing the most urgent poverty on earth, not even close. And so like this, I guess, is a supplement to what I was saying earlier. So when you talk about free trade, deregulation, et cetera, et cetera. But then when we get down to redistribution, I'm saying let's start talking about funding malaria relief before
Yeah.
we start talking about a UBI. Now, this sort of also though goes to your point, which is when I say, "Oh, I'm okay with like some redistribution," and suppose I'm wildly influential and people start listening to me, like it's just not really politically feasible to like get lots and lots of money to go to the Against Malaria Fund. Like it's just not.
Yeah.
Like I just can't see Joe Biden or Donald Trump or whomever being like, "Wow, like I am allocating billions and billions of dollars to malaria." Um, and so here again, you could make the argument that I should just never talk about it because to the extent people will listen to me, they will run with a distorted version of my view. But I'm not worried about it. Nobody listens to me. I haven't
Well,
convinced you. I haven't convinced you. Who am I going to convince? Nobody
well,
listens to me.
well. Look, so this is a broader libertarian picture here, in that, like, okay, you know what happens to libertarians a lot is something like, you know, Israel versus Hamas happens, and then libertarians end up arguing about that, and it's like, why are you even bothering? This is not in any way libertarian activity. It was not brought about by libertarian morals or ideas in any way. And it's like, if your goal is to convince people that, leaving people alone is the best way, and private property or whatever it is, the best way to have a good human existence, it's like, maybe that is, if that's the end game, that's what we should concentrate on the whole time, right? Like the whole time, like, forget
Well,
arguing about.
well, it depends. It depends on what you mean by the whole time. So
Yeah,
I think there are, that there are times for advocacy, and I don't know, maybe this is just the philosopher in me, but there
yeah.
are times for just the search for truth. And so I think it is true that replacing the status quo with a UBI would be an improvement. But to say that that's true is perfectly consistent with with saying that, yeah, but you shouldn't talk about it. I mean, I think this came up in our discussion last time
It
about
did a little.
utilitarianism,
Yeah,
which is like,
yeah.
yeah, it's like I think there's a decent chance that utilitarianism is the correct theory. But then there are all these weird problems that arise if people actually try to implement it directly, and you say, oh, maybe it's just better to keep it a secret. I'm not like, that doesn't scandalize me. I'm not sure if that's true, but it wouldn't shock me if it's true. And I say, okay, you know, when I'm like, I don't know, like doing philosophy or something like that, I'm out trying to find out, I don't know, what's true about moral theory or something like that. But then I can sometimes put on my advocacy hat and be like, oh, like don't so much worry about arguing about all the fine grain details of utilitarianism. Just like give some more money to the Against Malaria Foundation. Like don't like calculate every single action that you take. That's not going to end well. Just give some more money. And I can be like, look, like if you're going to the polls, or like if you're doing some political advocacy, I'm not going to push you to do UBI stuff. Like I said, that's pretty far down the list. I would say focus on things like, I think housing deregulation is a big thing. I think like pharmaceutical stuff is also very, like, all sorts of stuff. So insofar, so like if people do listen to me and they're like, Freiman, tell me what to fight for. Nobody's asked me this, by the way. I've got to continue to press this point. Nobody cares. But if somebody's like, Freiman, tell me what I should do. I would say, like, get to work on, and if you must do politics, if I can't convince you to do effective altruism, you must do politics. I would say, like, things like housing deregulation. And then when we've got that fixed, then we might start talking about seeing what we can do with the UBI.
But doesn't it seem like housing deregulation perfectly fits with every definition of libertopia, right? Again, assuming you hold those base assumptions, right? The deregulation, markets are better, all of that. That's just an opportunity to explain all that stuff, right? But getting into the basics of, like, oh, is whatever, Ukraine better than Russia? Is Russia but I mean, like, I might have opinions about these things internally, but I don't know if I would jump into that on the basis of, like, getting the world view that I want out to people. You know what I mean? Like,
No,
yeah.
no, I get that, but you might say, look, like there's I don't know, there's more to conversation and intellectual exploration than getting your worldview out there and accepted. Like I think some things are just, they're sort of like intrinsically interesting and important. And also, though, on the UBI point, so to put this in the context of UBI, I think it actually like illuminates some really interesting foundational debates about libertarianism. So you would have the sort of hardline Nozick types who say, like, look, this discussion that we're having right now, where we say, well, what are the effects on economic growth if we institutionalize UBI? He says, look, those might be interesting, but they kind of miss the basic point. The basic point is you cannot tax my income to fund a UBI. So it's off the table as a matter of moral principle. Like that's not my position, but it's an interesting position. It's worth talking about. And I say, no. Like this is not the right way to think about what justifies libertarianism. It's not really about like rights in the way that you think it is, Nozick. It's about producing good consequences. And so, like at a minimum, I think it illuminates some really interesting questions about libertarian. Like, why be a libertarian? Is it because it has good consequences? Is it because people have certain rights that
Yeah.
require that they be treated in certain ways? And if you have that view versus the other view, you could reach very different opinions about something like the UBI.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's why I was sort of stumbling over myself earlier about if you accept all the background arguments that a libertarian typically has, because I know there are whole other conceptions of libertarianism that, don't accept some of the most popular background positions that libertarians hold. Um, but then I think UBI becomes like a worse way to have that conversation because again, it's just like, well, if taken far enough, just allow people who don't really hold any libertarian background position, whatever direction, left, right, I don't care. It will give them like, look, even the libertarians agree with us, and then we're sitting there with a UBI on top of the present situation, and I'm going, damn it, Freiman.
Like I said, I love this assumption that people are
Yeah, yeah.
listening to me. I mean, I don't know. So like, here's a philosophical question. So like, there's this interesting discussion in. So like, Mike Humer talks a bit about this style of case in his book, The Problem of Political Authority. So like, people are like, oh, like taxation is theft and so on. It's a violation of rights. Say, okay, nevertheless, there could be cases where maybe it's a justified violation of rights. And so I forget exactly the case that he talks about, but it's, somebody is, it's like they're gonna die, they're gonna freeze to death or something like that. And the only way to save them is by, stealing somebody's coat and giving it to them. So you might say, like, oh, that's a rights violation. It's not your coat. But the benefit produced by this unjust transfer is the benefit is so great that we should do it. Um, I think that's pretty. So I'm not totally on board with the way he thinks about rights, but like I still think that's a pretty compelling position. Like I think in that case, you got to take that. And suppose it's like a jacket warehouse. There's just like a stockpile
Yeah.
of jackets somewhere that somebody owns and they never use. I think clearly you got to steal the jacket. And so then you say, all right, well, now, even if you're kind of a right person, you have something like redistribution on the table. Now, a point that Humer makes, which I think is very important, is like, this is like not really what transfer spending in a country like the US is like. And so I think this is a problem about the way a lot of people think about transfer spending in the US. Like, oh, like the welfare state is justified because it provides like milk to school children. It's like it does do that. That's not the majority of what it does.
Right.
And so like if that's all it did, like that's a different conversation. So like the jacket case is like plausibly more similar to like taxing people to fund malaria relief in a different country. I
Yeah.
think that, but so anyway, this is like I know I'm throwing a lot at the wall here, but the idea is I think even if you're a rights person, you say, look, in principle, there are cases where we can redistribute. And then redistribution is on the table. And then again, a UBI is on the table. You can't just sort of rule it out, say, in principle, we could never do anything like this. Then it becomes like a more interesting conversation about the details.
Yeah, and I'm sympathetic with what you're saying. The reason, like I said, that I think an anarchist capitalist situation is best is I think that it will produce the best outcome realistically. Like if that so if I could set up that social situation, I think it would outcompete other social situations. I might be wrong about that. And I'm certainly not the type that comes to that with the, hey, I like you can't scratch my finger to stop a meteor from destroying the Earth type of
Right.
person. Like to me, that's on the face of it just insane for several reasons, including just normal human well, just human norms about how we treat each other. I think so like some of this is that there's I don't know if it's non-overlapping, but we're talking about with redistribution, like what should the law be? What should the government do? Should there be a government? And then there's the separate question of like, how should we treat each other? And I become more sympathetic with your coat scenario on the separate question versus the question of law and government, where I don't know that that's really the realm of like just for instrumental reasons, I don't think that's the proper realm for that question. Anyway, I don't know if that made
Well,
any
so let
sense,
me
but
ask you a follow-up, if I may.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
you would then steal the jacket.
Yeah, in the absent any other information, just in the scenario you gave, where there's a pile
Yeah.
of useless jackets and a guy freezing, I'd give him the jacket for sure. Yeah.
And
But
so the IRS skims a little bit off your income and gives it to malaria relief. You're
well,
all right.
um, I don't think no, because it's not the same thing, right? I don't think it's exactly the same thing for reasons that you were just articulating about this is not really what the government does, right? Like,
Right.
so I think there's a difference there. Now, if somebody could prove to me that there was a system where I don't care what you call it, could be the IRS just working very differently than it is constituted, could take a percent of my income and save whatever number of people abroad. I think that's a lot more defensible than what actually happens. And I don't think I'm not terribly upset by that in the grand scheme of things. But I don't, again, for instrumental reasons, think that the IRS is capable of doing that. Like I like
No,
that's my
yeah. No,
yeah.
no, I'm sympathetic to that. So,
Yeah.
there's a reason this is not the status quo. Is like they're not
Yeah.
strong incentives for American, political institutions to be doing this.
Yeah.
Um, and I think this is, yeah. I mean, so I'm with you there. Like in terms of the feasibility, like there's a reason why we're not spending tons and tons of money on effective foreign aid. It's like an
Yes.
incentive
Yeah,
issue. So I think that's
exactly.
right. And I
Yeah.
mean, but so this also though is I think I mean to kind of circle back to the UBI question. Like, so I think another reason in favor of the UBI is when you look at sort of the biggest parts of like American transfer spending, that they actually have like some downright harmful effects. Stuff like price controls on pharmaceuticals. So like this is part of like what's going on with Medicaid right now, for example, in the US, is like price controls to keep like prescription drug prices down, stuff like that. And you say this kind of goes to your point about let's worry about the future. Um, there's a lot of evidence that that's going to slow down the rate of pharmaceutical innovation. It's very, very expensive to come up with new drugs for a
Yeah.
variety of reasons, not just R&D, but the regulatory process and so on. And so you say, look, if you like got rid of that, like that's downright harmful, where you sort of package together these price controls with other parts of transfer spending. You say like that's a downright bad, because
Yeah.
it's going to result in fewer drugs. This is bad for future generations. So I say UBI doesn't have that problem. So you say you get rid of Social Security, get rid of Medicaid, Medicare, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe, like, this is another controversy, maybe you force people to spend some of their UBI on like catastrophic health coverage. That's like, so like Milton Friedman talked a lot about like how he was okay with like catastrophic health coverage. I'm open to that. But so I think that's a reason for replacing the status quo. Or like Social Security, for example, it's like there are these funding issues. It's just a bad deal for like the average American. So if you just said, look, you don't ever have to pay anything into Social Security, invest that as you see fit in whatever sort of retirement savings you want. I have a lot more money in retirement than I'm going to have. And
You
so you give
would.
me a
Yeah.
UBI.
Yeah.
Why? Well, but
You no, no, no. I said
most
you
people
you
would.
would. Well, a lot of people wouldn't though. Like a lot of people have the option to invest their money right now, but I look on the news and it says like the average American, who is by far richer than most people on the planet, doesn't have $200 to fix their car, right? Like, so I'm like, well, what decisions went into that exactly? Exactly. Now, some people undoubtedly arrive at these positions not of their own fault. You mentioned earlier too, things are institutionally more expensive than they really should be. So like that doesn't help people. I understand that. But there's going to be a huge amount of people, right? Where we're getting so far away from the jacket to the freezing person scenario. Now we're like giving a jacket to somebody who just likes tearing jackets. He's just like,
Well,
man, I
so
need another.
okay.
Yeah,
So what if I said, I mean, this is, yeah, I mean, now we're getting a bit off the UBI, but it's like, so
yeah.
what if I said, all right, is the UBI, I'll give you the UBI, but you have to allocate 10% of that to retirement savings.
Like, so you have to pick a stock or something you're going to buy to the whatever. Well,
Something like that. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I would think that that would, again, this is, I don't want any of this, but if that was the case, I think that would be more reasonable than just handing a lot of irresponsible people money. Right? Like, I think that
So
would
I
be
can,
better.
okay, so
Yeah.
if I make some tweaks to the UBI, I can get you slightly more on board.
Yes, you could. Yeah. So like I want to be rational in everything I think. Doesn't mean I'm successful in it, but I do want to be rational genuinely. So like yes, there are things you could tell me that hey, I'm going to tweak the UBI this way or that way and I would be happier with it for sure. But I still don't know if I would make it. Now I'm thinking about you know the Simpsons episode with the was it the burlesque house and it's like and Skinner's like I was only there to find directions on how to get away from there. And I
That's
feel like
right. Yeah.
I feel like that's me with UBI. I'm talking about it right now so that I can find directions to
You want to find out why it's wrong.
yeah, I want to yeah, see why is everybody talking about this so much when like there's something like you've mentioned 10 other things I think are perfectly in line with libertarianism that are much better uses of time from housing to labor markets to effective altruism, which I have other, we won't get into that, but I would much rather people buy mosquito nets and anti-malarial drugs for people than you know the status quo. So
Well,
these all seem
yeah,
better
no.
to me. These,
Well, so let me put in a pitch though for maybe why it could actually be good to advocate for it.
sure.
And this is just speculation. You know, I don't know how to market libertarianism. You know, I just sort of speak my mind. But like, here's a thought.
Yeah.
Like I think a lot of people, a lot of people are reluctant to embrace libertarianism because they think that a lot of the sorts of regulations that libertarians want to eliminate would result in a lot of people sort of being worse off being in poverty. So you say something like, oh, you're a libertarian, like you want to get rid of like minimum wage laws, and like, yeah, I want to get rid of minimum wage laws. Like you want to get rid of, or like you want to, you know, enable people to sell their kidney, all this stuff, and they're like, but wait, so like, what then if you have a person who's like making $1 an hour? They're like they're going to be preyed upon by kidney buyers, and they're going to sell their kidney, and they're going to be exploited. And you could say, well, you don't actually have to worry about that because this is going to be backstopped by UBI, so they're not going to have to like sell their kidney out of desperation. So I don't think it's clear that the effect of
Hmm.
uh, advocating for a UBI is actually going to be negative for libertarians. So you say like you don't have to really worry about the minimum wage and exploitation stuff like that because that's taken care of by the UBI. And so it's like you can get rid of this like really inefficient regulation, and just say that we're going to address this worry about people in poverty being exploited by just cutting them a check every month.
Yeah. Okay.
Again, I have no idea, but that strikes me as something that might make it a bit more palatable for people.
Right. Okay. So if I started noticing something like that happening, I would then see more utility in talking about UBI as a way to have a better outcome, right? But like,
I think you cut out. Can you hear
oh,
me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I just the last
Can
word
you
I
hear me?
heard was something like, "Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear
Oh,
me?"
yeah. My mic got turned down. I could hear you the whole
Okay.
time. Sorry.
Okay. The last thing I heard was something like, if people responded that way, I would find
Yeah.
more utility in it. And then I lost you.
Yeah, yeah. So that's right. So if I saw more examples of people responding that way, I would think it was I'd find more utility in it. But what I see almost uniformly is just um, the government and especially in my country, you're uh, basically just saying UBI must go on top of these other things because we owe it to people, and there's no discussion of like there's not even really a discussion of why we owe it to people or anything like that. It's just a political, incentive. It's just sounds good. But I actually, so like right now, and I'm really not a political person at all. Like, but like right now, our Conservative Party is, oh God, like they got to be double the support of the Liberal Party of Canada, and these are the two parties that are the only two parties that have ever governed Canada. If the election was held today, the Conservatives would be forming a majority government by far. It's not even clear that the Liberal Party will exist in its present form after an election under those polling numbers. And largely what's happening there, and these are bad reasons to vote for the Conservatives, and I know this, but this is what's happening. People are tired of paying high prices. Their homes cost too much. Like for a townhome here in Ottawa, it's $1 million, right? Like that's insane. Nobody can afford this. The yeah, food costs too much, et cetera, et cetera. So now we have the leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, who has been gaining support by explaining money printing to Canadians, like and how it causes inflation and how it pushes money to different markets. And he's not the best at it because he's not an economist. He has bad reasons to be doing this. I don't particularly like him for a bunch of reasons too. But I'm sitting here watching that going, holy crap, people are actually listening to an argument about markets. Um, so I'm not sure the like the present political climate is good for UBI in either direction. Like
Yeah, so that point is well taken. But so here's what I would say is, uh, if I were a prominent political figure, I would be more selective about the sorts of points and policies that I emphasize.
right.
But this does sort of go back to the point that like no, like nobody really listens to me. Maybe a handful of people listen to me. I think that's optimistic. But then it's like I'm not like really concerned that I'm going to shift the national political dialogue in any particular direction. But I think so. Like and I mean this though is also a point that's relevant to our earlier discussion about utilitarianism. Is like you might have different sorts of responsibilities depending on how prominent and influential you are. So I think if there were like a libertarian who was like a serious presidential candidate and on the debate stage and on TV all the time, I would say, hey, look, like let's not talk so much about the UBI. Let's talk about housing deregulation, all the stuff we covered before. Because that person has a platform that I don't, that person has influence that I don't. But me, it's like I'm just kind of it's almost it's not all that different from like if I'm like tweeting about the Philadelphia Eagles or Limp Bizkit. It's like it's not like the highest value like use of a tweet, but it's like who cares? Like it's not doing any harm because like I could always be tweeting about effective altruism, for example. And I would say if I thought that like exclusively tweeting about effective altruism would actually do good in the world, I would definitely do. I would say like forget tweeting about new metal. I'm just tweeting about effective altruism.
Okay,
It's like
but
like
you're a human being and you have to have fun sometimes, right? And tweeting about new
there
metal
you
is
go.
is fun. Yeah, and so
Yeah,
if
I shouldn't
that's
say it is high value actually for
yeah,
me.
for
I don't
you,
know for the
yeah.
world, but for me.
So
This
yeah,
but this but this also illustrates how I have no influence. I don't nobody like there's not a new metal. Well, there is maybe a bit of a little new metal renaissance, but like it's not attributable to me. Like if I had this much influence, that it would be nothing but new metal in every music venue in the world.
right.
Sadly, this is not the case.
Okay, so this whole project is entirely for fun, the UVI thing.
So I do think one difference between like the new metal case and the UBI stuff
Yeah.
is the new metal stuff is just for fun, but like the UBI stuff is just like sort of working at a view that I think is correct. The view being it would be an improvement over the status quo. And so here again, I think I don't have to be like super selective about what I talk about or what I tweet about because I'm just not that influential. And so I'm like, I'm trying to work out this view about politics, economics, and so on. And like, I think that's sort of intrinsically interesting and intrinsically worth doing. But yeah, if again, I were like on the debate stage, and lots of people were listening to me, I would perform differently in that context than I do on Twitter.
Yeah.
I would say that's not the time for me to be like engaged in just like purely theoretical intellectual pursuits. Like that's just like a different context.
Right. I know
So
it's
get
just
me on
yeah,
that
sure.
stage. Get me on that stage, and I'll shut
And
up
you'll
about
shut
the
up. Yeah.
UBI.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yeah, that's a that's yeah challenge for you. If you want me to shut up, you got to get me on the presidential debate stage.
All right. Well, hopefully this episode
It
helped.
takes a lot to get me to shut up. That's
Yeah.
like it's a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, you told me once you don't even listen to your own advice when it comes to
Well, that's
bias.
I can't even persuade myself. I mean,
Yeah,
what
yeah.
hope is there?
Yeah. All right. All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I thank you so much for
Likewise,
episode your second appearance here. And
my pleasure.
I hope to have you back again another time. So,
Sure, I'd love to. Thanks for having me.
all right.